Hi, my name's Penny, and today I wanted to talk about some disappointing books. So this is a Strikeback Videoathon prompt. I will leave the links to the hosts of the Strikeback Videoathon down below. Basically, it's a videoathon to connect small booktubers and help those who are close to making the monetization threshold get across that bump, given that YouTube just changed their terms, so some people will be losing out there. But for the rest of us, it's just a really great time to connect and find some other small good booktubers. Good small booktubers. That would be a better way of arranging those adjectives. Anyway, I have lots of disappointing books to talk about, I found out once I started writing a list, so let's talk about them. So the first one would be Falling Kingdoms by Morgan Rhodes. You see lots of people talking about this series on Booktube. It's still going. It's like 7 books or some nonsense like that. People talk about it being like Game of Thrones. There's 3 different kingdoms, I think, that are at war, and there's a whole bunch of interplay between the characters. Lots of characters, supposedly lots of character deaths. But personally, I read the first book. I found it very disappointing. Then when I saw everybody still saying it was great, I made myself read the second book. I hated it possibly even more. And so I've never looked at that series again, and I'm quite happy with that. In my opinion, the characters just seemed really shallow and the writing was terrible. I just always remember this one line where it said 2 people looked exactly the same but opposite, and I was like, that doesn't make any sense, and the rest of the description didn't really clarify things, and there was just so many times when it seemed like that. Didn't really care about any of the characters. But just overall disappointing. The next disappointing book I want to talk about would be Truth Witch by Susan Dennard. So again, this is another one that people rave about on Booktube. They talk about the strong friendships between the 2 main characters. A Truth Witch called Safi, who can tell if people are telling the truth, and also a Thread Witch called Isolde, who can see the links between different people. I mean, I understand the magic system is quite an interesting concept, the fact that you've got these different kinds of witches who all have quite interesting powers, or some of them are less interesting. And some of the relationships are a little bit interesting, but the friendship people talk about, very quickly the 2 characters are separated and hardly talk to each other anymore. Although they care about each other and they often think about each other, they're just not together, so that relationship isn't really developed. And just so often the characters do such stupid things that don't make any sense. And maybe I could overlook that if it wasn't for the fact that I personally find the writing style very clunky. I know different people have different tastes, so it's quite possible that you would like it, but for me, I just found it very disappointing. So the next 2 disappointing books I want to talk about are time travel books. So I love the concept of time travel. I think it has the potential to add so much complexity to the plot of a story, and just time travel has such interesting concepts on the way we perceive the world that whenever I see a time travel story, I get super excited. And maybe I have too high expectations, and that's my problem. But the first one that I read and was disappointed with was Passengers by Alexandra Bracken. So this follows a girl from our time who gets sent back in time. I don't even know what time. She jumps through time, basically. It's like a scavenger hunt through time. The time travel concept was interesting. Basically, in this world, there's portals where you can travel to other years, but always the same part of the year. So if it's May 31st in one year, then when you time travel, it'll be May 31st in whatever year you've gone to. So I think it had a lot of potential, but I just hated the main character. I think I hated her right from the start, and I never really got over that. And I feel like a lot of the relationships that she built with other characters didn't really have any realistic foundation. They just seemed to spring out of nowhere. And so while I very rarely DNF series, this is one where I read the first book and I'm pretty certain I have no interest in picking up the next book in the series. So then the second time travel book that I was disappointed in was the first 15 Lives of Harry August bye. I actually think I might have liked this if I'd read it more in physical form, but unfortunately I read it in audiobook form and I didn't listen to a sample beforehand, which probably would have changed my decision to listen to it because I just didn't really like the narrator. I think this is making me sound like quite a judgmental person, like I just decide I don't like things from first impressions. But really, I found the character's voice made me dislike him. But because the story is told from first person, if you find the main character's style of talking to be off-putting, then it's very hard to change your impression of them, or at least that's my experience. I also found the book quite confusing from an audiobook perspective because it tends to switch back and forth between his most recent life and the action and the mystery that's happening there to flashbacks to his previous life where other stuff is happening that's sometimes relevant, sometimes not. And the audiobook, I found that very hard to follow along. Sometimes I forgot what time we were in and who he was even talking to. But again, this did have a really interesting time travel concept in that the main character basically lives his life circular, so every time he dies, he gets reborn again, but in the same life with all his memories, but just as a child again. And he has to go through all the tediousness of being a baby and a child and learning everything again. And there's a society of people who live their lives like this, who work together and help each other out. But then at the end of his 12th life, I think, a young girl comes to him on his deathbed and says, we're passing this message back through time. The end of the world is getting closer and closer and we don't know how to stop it. So yeah, really interesting concept, but I would have preferred if it had been told in a more linear fashion. But again, that's just my opinion, so take it or leave it. So I think I talked about this next disappointing book in my December wrap-up and maybe some other videos since then, and that is the Thirst series by Christopher Pike. So originally, Christopher Pike released the Last Vampire series, and it was a 6-book series following this woman called, well, going by the name Alyssa Pern. It turns out she's the last vampire. She has really cool abilities, but she gets put in a whole bunch of weird situations. And eventually it gets into a bit of religious philosophy as she met Krishna when he was alive, and that had quite a profound effect on the way that she lives her life. I loved this series when I read it as a teenager, and then I found out as I was an adult that he had released more books in the series, so they basically rebranded the series as Thirst. They wrapped up those original 6 books as the first 2 or 3 books. I always forget. I think the first 2 books. And then he wrote 3 more books, so there's 5 books in total. In the 3rd book, she meets one of her descendants who is an Olympic athlete, and they somehow, I'm struggling to remember it now because I read it a while ago, somehow gets wrapped up in some kind of assassination situation. I can't really remember. I think in my head I'm getting it mixed up with Wolf by Wolf now, actually. But the 4th and the 5th book I read recently, it gets very into aliens and space travel and religion. You even take a trip down into the underworld or the afterlife. I don't know, there's a lot of interesting concepts, but not a lot of action, which is what I did really like about the earlier books, is how much action there was at the same time as having really interesting philosophy and dilemmas for Alyssa to overcome. But the last 2 books just got way too waffly for me, I think because he was trying to make the books so massive. So the first books were tiny and they were very digestible and they were great. But these books were just a bit of a disappointment, especially given how excited I was about finding more books from a series I loved in my teens. So, since we're talking about books from my teens, the next disappointing book would be Sweet Valley Confidential. So this is another book in the Sweet Valley High series, so most of you who are really young are maybe too young to remember the Sweet Valley series. It started out as Sweet Valley High, following these twins, Elizabeth and Jessica, but they also did a spin-off series, Sweet Valley Twins, when they were in middle school, and Sweet Valley University came out later when they were older and at university. There were hundreds and hundreds of books in this series, and I never read that many of them, but the ones I did read covered some really good themes, and I found them really interesting, even though it's kind of set up as Jessica is the more wild, selfish twin who cares about being cool and popular, and Elizabeth is the serious, studious twin who cares a lot about doing the right thing. Now, it's true that going into this, because I hadn't read all the Sweet Valley University books, I didn't know where they'd got to, but I was not expecting it to be like this. Through most of the earlier books, I always preferred Elizabeth. I think you're kind of supposed to, because she's the twin who's trying to always do the right thing. Although it's true that Jessica's also trying to do the right thing. She's just sometimes forgets to think about things. But in this book, I think they were trying to make Elizabeth relatable and that she had a bit of anxiety, but in a lot of ways it was like the new Gilmore Girls series, where Rory is no longer the Rory that's amazing and inspirational and makes you want to be better. Instead, she's kind of this screw-up failing at life, and that's how Elizabeth is doing in this book. And then Jessica is in this completely unhealthy relationship with Todd, who was always Elizabeth's long-term boyfriend. So I don't know where that got to, but the relationship was just ugh. And so between those two facts, this was just not enjoyable, and it didn't really address any important themes like a lot of the other books that I read did. So disappointing. So the last disappointing book that I will talk about is The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak. So many people told me that this was their favorite book, and so when I saw it in a book fair for $2, I was like, score, I can read that book that everyone says is so great. And then I read it, and it's not that I didn't like it. It was an okay story, but I think just there was so much hype. Everyone told me it was so amazing that I was expecting this to change my life, and instead it just seemed to take a long time to read. Although it's not quite as long as it seems for the thickness, it is quite a big font, and it is quite easy to get through, but for the most part I didn't find myself that emotionally invested in the characters, which, given the situation that they're in, I really would have expected to. In fact, it is true that especially near the end there were some bits that made me cry, but that was more about the situation. So this is set in World War II in Nazi Germany. So obviously there's some parts of that story which are going to have an emotional effect on you, but I didn't feel like it has had as much of an impact on me as I would have liked. I also found the thing everyone always raves about is the fact that this is told from the perspective of Death. So Death is a character and he's telling you this story. But honestly, I just found Death a bit annoying, and I didn't think that his perspective really added that much. It seemed more like a gimmick to me. So, yeah, disappointing. So of course these are all just my opinions, and you are very welcome to disagree with me. If you did really like some of these books, I'd love to hear what it was you really liked about them that maybe I'm overlooking. Or alternatively, feel free to have a rant in the comments about books that you found really disappointing, and maybe we can bond over it. Or at least maybe some people will know to avoid those books, because I think as well often books are really hyped even before people have read them on Booktube, and you only hear the hype, and then once people have read them, if they didn't like them, they never mention them again. So if people don't talk about their disappointing books, then no one's ever going to know that all the hype was just hype. So I think it's important to talk about it and share our experiences, because that's the whole point of why we're here. I'm also just going to mention, I've talked about how hot it is at the moment here in Auckland, down in the southern hemisphere in New Zealand, for those of you who don't know. But today I came up with a solution. So I've got this little ice pack that is for putting in lunch boxes, and I've just been holding it while I talk, and I'm nowhere near as hot as some of the other times I was filming. So if you're ever filming and it's really hot, there's a solution. So hopefully that will be useful to some of you. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.